Hello everyone. It is Kathryn sending Earth Creatrix, Master Intuitive Energy Healer, here today as a multi-consciousness bridge and help to hopefully break down and explain a little bit more, bring a little more clarity to what is dimensional reality? What does that even mean? And especially in terms of, what does ascension even mean? Breaking that down in terms of understanding different levels of consciousness, dimensional shifts, timeline shifts. Hey, Tammy Lip, if you're joining, let me know you're here. Say hi. If you're watching this on my business page, which you probably are at this point because I haven't shared it yet, you're welcome to go ahead and share this. In fact, please do. If you want to share this information to your group, to your people, I welcome you and invite you to do that. So while people are jumping on here, I'm going to share this in a couple different places. And then we're going to get into this. Because I know this is confusing for a lot of people, and it's kind of putting us through this kind of emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual tailspin right now. So this talk, this discussion, I really hope to clarify and kind of bring like this kind of like settling feeling to you from this talk here today, so you can understand things a little bit better. So I'm going to share in Ascending Earth Creatrix, which is my group. So if you're not in my group, my free Facebook group is Ascending Earth Creatrix. I'm going to share this in Cosmic Medicine Woman. Abundance Flash Mob, because I promised I would. And one more place. And then I will get back to you. One more spots. Hopefully more people will jump on. I know it's Sunday. People are off doing their own thing. People have holiday parties to attend, and it's the day to do stuff with the kids. I get it. So this will be a replay. And it also, when I do these live talks, I almost always post this on my YouTube channel, which is Kathryn Massell, easy enough to find. And then I have a podcast, which is on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, probably a lot more I don't even know about. The Abundant Intuitive. So if you like to listen to me as an audio, I recommend listening and checking out, subscribing to my podcast. Hello, Katrina. So I like to sleep in on Sundays, but for me, that seems to be download day for me. I have no idea why this is. I like to sleep in, which means, 10:30, 11 o'clock. I like sleep. Sleep is good. But usually I'll get woken up at 4 or 5 in the morning with downloads, or I'm accessing information much like I received today and much like what I'm sharing with you today. Hi, Stephanie. I'm knitting while listening to you. Perfect. Because there's a lot of timeline fluctuation right now is the best way to describe it, with us jumping into different levels of consciousness. And so, there's a lot of talk about 5D, we're all ascending, all of that, but what is happening is we are accessing higher levels of consciousness all the time. So we have a lot of different timelines, portals, levels of consciousness. Those words are all interchangeable, by the way, of accessing levels of 60, 70, 80, 90, and sometimes even beyond. It depends on where you are at your particular point or level in your journey of spiritual evolution. But there is a lot of fluctuation and skipping, kind of moving ahead at a very accelerated rate, and kind of this feeling like we're moving backwards. That's an illusion, because time is an illusion here, which is part of our awareness, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But in order to break down this idea of ascended consciousness, let's just say it that way, or talking about ascension, okay? It's really important to think of it as accessing higher levels of consciousness. That's what ascension really is. This planet is going through an ascension process, and because we are so intimately related to Mother Earth, our planetary home, we are ascending as well. However, there's some kicking and screaming and resistance from many people in this 3D timeline, and I'll talk about all that in a minute. But the way I'm going to break this down for you to make it a little bit better to understand is through our spatial relationships with what we understand as our reality. Better said, we define our reality by where we are in space, meaning we can define ourselves and derive meaning from our existence by understanding the relevance of things in our world, okay? How relatable things are to us in this time-space 3D dimension. So I'm going to explain things through our spatial relationship of things so that you can understand this a little bit better. Because we are 3D beings, and we are, what 3D really is, we're talking about spatial relationships, you're talking about different dimensions, you're talking about the first dimension, which is a straight line, you're talking about the second dimension, which is height, and the third dimension, which is depth. And as 3D beings, we occupy that level of form. We understand that very well. So being able to break this down in terms of understanding all this through our level of getting spatial relationships, this might land with you in a way that's more accessible to you than the way you've had this explained before. Hi, Sarah. So our relationship to things in space, you're going to hear me refer to it this way a lot, is basically the things we bump up against, okay? Because, again, we understand things through a spatial relationship. We derive meaning from our lives in terms of spatial relationships to things, okay? How much of something, how little of something. We understand duality here. The presence of something or the absence of something. And what we're constantly doing is bumping up against things to derive meaning in our lives, okay? And this will make more sense as I'm talking. So when you think about spatial relationships, I'm going to break this down right away, okay? You think about before there's any dimension, before there is any spatial relationships of one thing to another, there is just void. There is just empty space. It is pure infinite consciousness, pure being. It has no frame of reference to understand itself. It just is, okay? So then we introduce the first dimension. That would be a straight line, okay? We introduce the second dimension. That would be the dimension of height, okay? So we start to add more texture to this void so that we begin to have frame of references for other things. Hey, Dina. In the third dimension, we add depth. So we understand how deep something is or how far something extends outward in space. We have a greater understanding then of spatial relationship. This is how we understand our lives, largely because we're describing basically the third dimension, and we are three-dimensional beings. We understand who we are. We derive meaning from our lives by understanding that, even though it's an illusion, we interpret everything through form, through matter. We think of our bodies as being very dense, energetic matter. It's not, actually, in the quantum perspective of things, but that is how we derive meaning from who we are here in this dimension, is form and our relationship to other forms. Okay, that's 3D, essentially. In the fourth dimension, it's largely agreed upon that this represents time, okay? In the more ethereal realms, this is thought, wordless prayer, telecommunication, psychic communication, but it really is, if we're talking about in terms of spatial relationships, we add the dimension then of time. This is something we also understand and we actually create here in 3D reality, is this idea of things existing on a continuum, linear time. So how we mark time or understand time here also allows us to derive meaning from our lives. Past, present, and future, correct? Okay, so we got that out of the way. Does that make sense to everybody? Give me a heart if that makes sense, okay? So just from a basic spatial relationship perspective of understanding dimensions, that's what it is, okay? Now, these are all things that we bump up against. Up into the 4D realm, these are all things that we essentially bump up against in terms of defining more of our form, deriving more of meaning from our lives from how we bump up against other types of matter, okay? What happens when we move into 5D and beyond is what we are bumping up against then is consciousness, okay? So we go beyond spatial and linear constructs, the things that make sense to us or form our reality or how we derive meaning here in 3D, and we start bumping up against perspectives, higher levels of perception, higher levels of perceiving thought, thinking things, feeling things, go beyond linear time and space, or what we would understand as things in our time and space continuum here. Okay, does that make sense so far? I don't want to lose you guys, but what we're accessing then really from 4D is where we start to close the gap between bumping up against form, or where I should say we form that bridge of consciousness where we are still bumping up against form, but then we start bumping up against non-linear constructs or non-linear time, non-spatial form. Sorry if that sounds really out there. Just stay with me here, okay? And 5D is where we really kind of leap in and we take that point of departure in, bumping up against things that's no longer form, but rather consciousness. And from there, we keep accessing, hopefully, increased levels, frequencies of consciousness, higher vibrations of consciousness, okay? More light. This is where we move beyond the density of ego reality and we access more information, because that is what light is. Light is information. Hi, Lori. Happy Sunday to you, too. So this is where, when we start to move into and lean into 5D, we access different perspectives, different perceptions, levels of perception. We go beyond the veil in terms of what the ego mind and the construct of the physical 3D body, the density of that will allow us to see. And we open up to fields of potential and ways of thinking, feeling, being, doing, having, okay? Our perception of reality continues to shift and take new form. When we access 6th dimension, it's the same thing. We are accessing a higher frequency or level of consciousness. 7th dimension, 8th dimension, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and beyond, okay? We are bumping up against things to give us meaning here in 3D, but in terms of consciousness, when we start bumping up against different levels of consciousness from 5D and beyond, we're still bringing more meaning into our lives, but this is beyond the physical. Does that make sense? Okay. But because we still have a physical body, and I'm reading from my notes here, so forgive me if I'm looking down a lot here, because I wrote this all this morning at 7 a.m. when I was woken up out of beautiful slumber to bring this all to you here today. But because we still have a physical body, which is perceived as dense matter, we perceive our body as dense, it's matter. You can pump, bang on your chest with your fist, and you feel like this is solid, okay? This is dense matter. It's only a perception, because right now our focus of awareness and our attention is on our 3D reality. You're listening to me talk, you're hearing with your ears, you are tuned into sensory feedback or a sensory feedback loop that allows you to be focused on 3D reality, okay? But it just depends on what you're focusing on. If you choose to focus on something else that allows you to lean into 60, 70, 80, 90, that will be your perception. You'll have a whole different set of perception and perspectives at that point. So when we are in 3D, we are perceiving ourselves as dense matter. Even though we have these physical bodies, we are limited in terms of, yes, we can access all kinds of different levels of consciousness, but we are still fairly limited by being in this dense reality and having a focus of dense reality, because we are focused in this energetic vessel, which is our physical body, okay? And this means that we experience, because being in this physical body, we experience the 1st dimension of awareness, which is, straight line. We understand spatial relationships, right? 2nd dimension, the 3rd dimension, which comprises our consciousness here in 3D. So as long as we have a body, we can't really move beyond, or we can't get rid of, let's just say, the ego. We can transcend it, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But we can't get rid of it, okay? As long as we have a body, we can't fully opt out of 3D consciousness, okay? So as long as we experience our lives in relation to our spatial relationships in terms of the first 4 dimensions, straight line, depth, height, time, past, present, and future, linear time, we are, we're kind of in this limbo 3D, 4D. That doesn't mean that we can't step in and out of 5D, because many of us do all the time. Whether we're consciously checked into that or not is another story. So then, what does accessing 5D really mean? What does accessing 5D awareness, consciousness, and beyond really mean? Well, if you believe in the idea of planetary ascension, which says that, or aligns with this idea that you understand the Earth is going through a shift into a higher vibration. We're not going anywhere in a physical sense. It's not like poof, we're popping into this whole other reality, but we are shifting in our vibration. Planet Earth is taking us on this planetary ride where we are accessing a higher level of awareness, okay? Because remember, that's what I said dimensions are in terms of accessing higher levels of consciousness. The higher up you go, 3D, 4D, 5D, 6D, and beyond, okay? So we understand the Earth is going through a shift into a higher vibration. That means that universal forces are creating certain conditions which allow the consciousness of Earth, the planet, and everyone on it to reach an elevated level of experience, okay? A heightened level of awareness. It would be another way to say it. So this creates conditions for every being on Earth to think, feel, and behave differently, if we choose that, okay? Because even though all of these shifts are happening, it does not negate our free will choice. Never, 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 never. And if you think about planetary ascension, and I mentioned universal forces coming together because there has been, let's just say, a cosmic summit, that there has been this unanimous decision that yes, it's time for the Earth to ascend because it has to, because there's such a certain timeline where things can't be supported anymore in a certain timeline that has worn out its welcome, and the Earth is ready to ascend. This has been something that's been coming for a long time. It's not like a last minute thing. It's been decided on thousands and thousands of years ago by a lot of different interplanetary beings who have interests, let's just say, in planet Earth. And it's very interesting for them to see what is happening here at this time. And we are getting a lot of assistance with this, but they can't ever, 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 ever mess with our free will. That means if right now everyone on this planet, human, plant, animal, decided we're not going to ascend, essentially we wouldn't. Because there would be so much resistance that even though planet Earth herself, which is her own consciousness, has decided, yes, it's time for me to ascend, it wouldn't be a productive or seamless process. There would be a lot of cataclysm, there would be a lot of chaos, there would be a lot of very traumatic events for everyone on this planet if we are in such diverse, polarized opposition to, meaning every human being or being of sentient life here on this planet decided we don't want to ascend, and Mother Earth says, well, yes, we are going to ascend. It would be just chaos. It would be total chaos. Luckily, that's not where we're at. There's many, many people on this planet who are waking up and are joyfully participating in this process of ascension. Thank goodness. Thank Goddess. But, sorry, I went off on that tangent. The Earth herself has already chosen to ascend, okay? She is beyond ego. So it's a little easier for her. Meaning she doesn't get mired in identity confusion like humans do. So this would be why we would collectively, let's just say, in the hypothesis that I just proposed to you, decide not to ascend. That would completely be a product of ego construct, which is a completely human phenomenon, the ego construct. So the only thing keeping humans from choosing ascension, the only reason why we would say from a place of free will choice, like, I don't want to ascend, is because we are mired in some level of ego consciousness. The only thing keeping humans from choosing ascension, for opting for higher consciousness or experience, is ego. okay? The fear of the unknown. Who will I be if I ascend? This constant preoccupation with an identity. You know, who am I if I lose who I am, right? It provokes lots of feelings of fear, lots of feelings of chaos and turmoil within, a lot of emotional upheaval. This is all ego construct stuff. What will I lose if I ascend? Will I lose my house? Will I lose my car? Again, ego construct. Why does everybody get to go? I don't think some people should be allowed to go and ascend. Why do they get to go? Look at them. Look at the life judgment. Again, another ego construct. I don't want to have to work that hard. Another ego construct. What does that mean? What does ascension even mean? Constantly trying to unravel this or deconstruct it or break it down into linear terms, spatial terms that we can understand with our intellectual reasoning mind. Again, another product of the ego. That sounds like a lot of work. It sounds scary. It sounds stupid. The list goes on and on and on. All assigned to ego consciousness, okay? So you are only making those judgments or submitting those queries about the whole topic or process of ascension if you are rooted in and playing follow the leader with the ego perspective. Does this make sense? Give me some hearts if this makes sense. So, all right, thanks for being with me. Thanks for hanging in. Hey, Heather Lawrence. So to access higher levels of consciousness, that means you have to transcend or live beyond the ego, which is confined to 3D, even 4D reality. Because remember I said 4D is that kind of, that bridge in our consciousness from where we go bumping up against things that are of form, that are physical, where we understand spatial relationships and understand our human phenomena, and where we kind of close that gap or enter that bridge of moving into 5D where we start bumping up against higher levels of consciousness, okay? When we learn to do that, when we learn to live beyond, hi Rachel, or move beyond, transcend that kind of follow the leader aspect that we have with the ego, meaning the ego is a servant, but it thinks that it's the master, and we've allowed it to act like it's the master, okay? So we're playing this kind of follow the leader game with the ego, allowing it to dictate to us who we think we are, who we believe we are. And this is a false projection of self. So when we learn to evolve beyond, transcend, live beyond the ego, move beyond the ego, you can right now access a higher level of consciousness. 5D, 6D, 7D, there's really no limit. Notice I didn't say get rid of ego, okay? Now this is a really important distinction to make because, and I said transcend, which means something totally different, which is basically living beyond or moving beyond the ego, that you still have awareness of it, but essentially it's an inert energy. It has no sway or hold over you. You have an awareness of it, but it's inert. It's inactive, dormant, okay? So it is still there, the ego, as a part of consciousness, because no matter how much we ascend, we are, as long as we're still in a physical body, we still have all of this awareness of all these different levels of consciousness from 1D on up, okay? As long as we have a physical body, we will not depart from that. Please understand that. You're not gonna, if you have a body, there's no way for you to live beyond it completely. And you can transcend certain levels of consciousness, like the ego, that keep you rooted in just one level of perception, but you can't get rid of it. Does that make sense? It is still there as part of your consciousness, but it becomes inert, inactive, dormant at higher levels of consciousness, and it doesn't run the show of your reality. That's another important distinction to make in 5D and beyond, because our consciousness is no longer limited to what is known through the filter of the ego. So the only information that the ego has, the only level of its ability to inform you, is based on what it already knows. And what you know in 3D physical reality are spatial relationships. Your physical relationship, spatial relationships to other things. The construct of time, meaning our time-space continuum here, okay? Past, present, and future. That is the only thing the ego has any ability to know. It can only know what is known. It can only know things that are a byproduct of past events and experiences. It has no idea to think for itself in terms of potentials available in the quantum field, for instance. It has no concept, awareness, or perception of that, because vibrationally, it is not available for any of that. Okay? Does that make sense? So what is known is form, and the way we bump up against things, experiences, space that come to us through sensory feedback with our environment. That's all the ego has the ability to know. So it can only inform you on those perspectives and those perspectives only, nothing beyond that. It can't inform you of potential available to you. It can't talk about possibility available to you. That's why your inner critic, which is a byproduct of your ego, only has ability to give you information about something that's happened before, good or bad. Usually bad, because the inner critic usually tells us all the ways that things could go wrong based on things that have already gone wrong, based on things in your past experiences and events, etc. So this means that the ego has only the ability to inform you of things that are based on a sensory feedback loop of input. That means how you directly relate to your physical environment. That means it only has the ability to give you information about form. It has no ability to give you information about consciousness. So if you are still rooted in this kind of game of playing follow the leader with your ego, and that is something you are constantly paying attention to, focusing on, that constant feedback sensory loop of information that comes to you from your outer environment, you are not vibrationally available to look at things that are part of the potential of accessing, let's just say, higher levels of consciousness. Okay? So the information that comes to you through your five senses, touch, taste, sight, smell, and sound, this is your sensory feedback loop from the environment. This is where the ego informs you of things, and that only. That's all it has the ability to do. So after 3D and even 4D, the ego has no frame of reference, since all we bump up against after 4D is consciousness, pure being, without any form of sensory input to bump up against. The ego has nothing that it can know anymore through its relationship to things in space. So it goes silent. It goes inert. Okay? Now, we don't have to go into this by default. In fact, it's better to start changing this trajectory now and start living beyond the ego now. Transcend it. Like I said, you can't get rid of it, but you can transcend it and live beyond it. You can move beyond the stranglehold of the ego. Okay? Because this is what's really keeping us in lower vibrational reality. It has no frame of reference for infinite space. It has no frame of reference for pure consciousness and the unknown. It can only know what's knowable. And what is knowable? The information that comes to us through sensory input. It has no information to give us about the unified field or infinite potential for being. It has no frame of reference there. Okay? So let's go back and think about planetary ascension again. The Earth is moving to a higher frequency. This is happening through higher vibrations of light entering the planetary field, or grid, if you want to call it that. So as this happens, the Earth naturally allows and accepts this shift into higher consciousness. So humans, on the other hand, still playing follow the leader to the ego, we're not ascending so easily for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Some are choosing to participate, actively participate in this timeline shift, in this paradigm shift, consciousness shift, and I use those words interchangeably because they basically mean the same things, into a higher perspective, an expanded place of awareness and perception, okay? If they're fully, I'm going to answer questions after, Tammy. I see your question. I want to get through this first, and then I'll answer questions. So if humans are fully willing to transcend the ego, then this is a bit smoother, this whole process of planetary ascension. That means less ascension symptoms. It means mostly because there's a less rigid defining of ourselves through sensory input as dense beings in space. So if we are transcending or moving beyond the ego, we stop defining ourselves solely by these dense beings that have this sensory feedback loop relationships to other things in space, i.e. our outer environment, our outer reality. Okay? So those of us who are here on this planet, who may not even know how, they might not even have any concept of ascension at all. A lot of people don't. They not even know how ascension works. They never even maybe heard the word before. They don't know how to, or they're not willing to move beyond ego. This is many people. They get lost in the illusion of 3D reality. They get lost in this lower vibrational realm, okay? And they get seduced. It's a very seductive place, 3D reality, because we get seduced into thinking that our outer reality is who we are on the inside. In fact, it's the opposite. Everything in our outer reality is a byproduct of what is first an internal state, correct? We get lost in this illusion of 3D ego identity, and those people are having the hardest time with ascension. That is why it seems like people on this planet are just going bonkers. People are losing their grip on reality. There is an incredible amount of chaos, violence, persecution, torture. We get lost in this very seductive illusion of 3D reality, okay? So think of this as, you know, the people that are really getting stuck in this illusion, those are the people who are most stuck in ego identity. Everything about how you define yourself, or those people who are stuck in that identity, everything about how they define themselves is in relation to sensory feedback from physical environmental cues, okay? So this is harder. This actually makes the body more dense. If you are aligned with this low vibrational state of being that aligns with a lot of the lower vibrations in the emotional spectrum, you're talking about greed, you're talking about anger, you're talking about blame, resentment, hatred, you're talking about even grief and sorrow, you're talking about persecution and torture, you're talking about very, very low end vibrational stuff. The inability to forgive is a huge one. Holding on to a great level of blame and resentment is the opposite of being able to forgive, and there's a lot of people on this planet holding on to those vibrations right now. It's someone else's fault, it's not me. The inability for people to take responsibility for their outer experience as being an internal state first. This is a massive, pervasive theme for many people on this planet right now. This is a real struggle. And that's another low vibration, this need to suffer, to struggle, to be in this constant victim mode, martyr mode, whatever that is, okay? This is harder for those people to allow more light in. When you are a very, very dense body like that, holding on to those emotional vibrations makes you a denser body. That's very, very aligned with ego awareness. So you can't literally, even, it doesn't matter, all these ascension codes, these higher dimensional codes that are reaching our planetary field and penetrating it, we are making ourselves so dense, or some people are in this timeline, that this light cannot come in because they're not vibrationally available for it, okay? Don't worry, I'm getting to a point here. Those of us, however, who are actively working to transcend the ego, we're having an easier time of making this consciousness shift, of closing this gap between walking the path of 3D and walking the path of 5D, okay? Those of us who are fully living beyond the ego now, or taking actions, involving ourselves in behaviors every day that allow us to move beyond the ego right now, we are having the easiest time of it because we're making our bodies less dense. We're actually, because we're accessing higher levels of vibration on the emotional spectrum, we're actually accessing more of our crystalline structure of being, which allows more light, okay? That means less ascension symptoms. You know, we stop bumping up against so much of the physical, and that's only going to happen if we become less dense. How do we become less dense? We move beyond the ego, start accessing higher vibrational emotions, ways of being, ways of thinking, ways of feeling. When this happens, you access more multidimensionality. Now understand, because of what I explained before about the dimensions, that we are basically a composite. Whether you think you're in 5D now or 6D or beyond, you are still accessing first, second, third, and fourth dimensional reality. So you're multidimensional. Even when you're a 3D being, you're multidimensional, because you are occupying different dimensions or having an understanding of and acting on you being a being that has different spatial relationships with things around you. That's multidimensionality, okay? You're able to access different perspectives. That's multidimensionality. You're able to access different ways of perceiving reality. That's multidimensionality, okay? So you only access more of it as you open yourselves up to perceive beyond the level of 4D, 5D, okay? You access more perspectives. You access more levels of perceiving beyond 3D that were previously veiled to you because of what you allowed the ego to tell you was real or truth or known. Does that make sense? Okay. But here's the thing. This is fluid. This is extremely fluid. Remember, 5D and beyond, you are bumping up against consciousness, right? You're no longer necessarily bumping up against so much form, but increasing amount of light codes coming into the planetary field, coming into our planetary grid. It allows us to keep experiencing different levels of perception, okay? So right now we have a lot of 6D, 7D, 8D, 9D energies coming in, portals of light coming in, integrating into the planetary field of Earth and upgrading it, okay? These light codes allow us to keep experiencing different levels of perception. So think about light as available information on ways of being, different states of awareness. Basically, these light codes that are coming in, what they are telling us are different ways that we can occupy different states of awareness, because light holds information, and this happens to be the information that's available to us at this time on this planet. But while we still have a body, we will use it as a frame of reference for our overall experience. We can't ever not use our body as a how we frame our overall experience, because we have no other vessel or vehicle for this. We have no other vehicle or vessel of understanding experience, whatever level it is, without our physical body, correct? There's no way you could sit and listen to me here today from beyond the self. Because what you're receiving is sensory feedback through an audio loop, hearing me talking. You can only and ever receive that through the physical vessel of your body, which is what you perceive as dense matter for now. So because of this frame, this physical vessel, this frame of experience, even though we're accessing these very, very high light codes, and some of us are really, all in terms of our energetic participation in accessing these higher levels of consciousness, you're never not going to know it without your body until you leave it completely, until you become pure light again and pure consciousness. So we go in and out of different levels of experience all the time. So this is fluid. This creates timeline shifts. This is just one of the things that creates it, by the way. But this talk is about dimensional reality and consciousness, so that's for another live talk. But this does create timeline shifts. It's one of the things that creates timeline shifts. That means, if you want to, in other words, explain a timeline, think of it as a different container of experience, okay? So one day, let me give you an example. One day you feel no different than a year ago. Okay, you may have done like an incredible amount of energy activating and done all of these workshops and access 7D consciousness, do work in the Akashic records, but you might just wake up one day and feel like, it's kind of like I did none of that stuff at all. I just feel normal. I feel like I did a year ago. I feel like I did 10 years ago. And what is normal, right? But the next day then, you feel awake, you feel aware, you feel lucid, you feel like open, you feel alive. You have this whole different perspective on your life or reality. You're framing it, you have a different perception, completely different than the day before. This is normal. As long as we have a physical body, this is normal. This is how this goes, okay? But that also means when you have this heightened level of perception, or you wake up and have that day where you have a higher level of awareness, you think, you act, and you behave differently okay? Because you're not in ego when you're in that elevated place, or you are transcendent of the ego, let's just say, and things seem possible in this timeline. And this timeline could be just a day, it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be an hour. That's a timeline, okay? It's a container of experience. So things might seem possible in this timeline or container of experience one day that yesterday did not, okay? This is also a paradigm shift, okay? This happens first for us on an individual level. A timeline shift is also a paradigm shift, okay? Now, we think of a paradigm shift as something that's like long lasting, but there we go, putting ourselves in the 4D construct of linear time again. A paradigm shift can happen in the span of something that feels like a blink of an eye, or it could be something that does feel like it lasts for decades, okay? Our perspectives on history, let's just say, large chunks of our time-space continuum here, what we call history, we think of things like, okay, well, women got the right to vote. That's a paradigm shift. It took a long time for them to get there, says you. In terms of the rest of the cosmos, that happened in the blink of an eye. So again, we have to transcend this idea of linear time. It's not easy because, again, as long as we have a physical body, we're going to bump up against these things that allow us to understand space and time and spatial relationships, okay? But this paradigm shift, always and ever, happens first for us on an individual level. It's happening for many of us at once, but it's known on an individual level first, okay? So the more people, let's just say, as we're experiencing paradigm shift, you have that day where you wake up. You feel awake, aware, lucid. You feel like, I'm downloading, accessing a bunch of information. There's things now I just know that I didn't know before, or I have the ability to expand into that I didn't have before. Once you create this paradigm shift for yourself, and let's just say the more people we bump up against that are also having this similar experience of a paradigm shift or a timeline shift, the more our timelines or containers of experience converge, overlap, weave together, merge to make a bigger overall timeline or container of experience, better said, even a container of transformation, okay? A bigger paradigm shift, a greater imprint or ripple effect, a wave of possibility, an impact of elevated consciousness. This moves the whole Earth's timeline into a paradigm shift for ascension, further forward. In essence, with enough momentum, and when this container of experience gets big enough, by having a lot of these experiences of merging, converging timelines that are of all a similar vibration, okay? It can't ever happen with different vibrations, okay? A timeline can only converge with another timeline of the exact same frequency and vibration to create a bigger one, okay? That should make sense, right? So let me say this again. In essence, with enough momentum, and when this container of experience, this timeline gets big enough, it creates a bigger shift in the time-space continuum, and you have a parallel reality. The Earth kind of forms like a perfect twin. It splits into a parallel reality of Earth that looks the same, seems the same, but it is on a different timeline because it holds a different vibrational timeline. It's on a different frequency, an elevated one. Does this make sense? I know I'm talking about big stuff here. You may want to go back and listen to this again. But this is where things get really interesting. And what I'm going to say next is where we really get stuck in ego, and you may want to listen even more closely here. And you may want to just close your eyes and turn off sensory input from anything you're seeing or smelling right now if you can, and just listen to the sound of my voice. Those folks I talked about before who don't know how to or are unwilling to ascend, don't want to, they're afraid to access higher consciousness beyond the ego, they remain a vibrational match to the old Earth. Okay? Those who have made the jump to 5D New Earth you know, because those of us who got together and we converged those timelines, we made a bigger one, and there was enough momentum, there was enough push, there was enough impact from the level of our vibrational energy collectively that we created this perfect twin that is of a different vibration of planet Earth. In other words, the new Earth, okay? Those who have made that jump to the 5D new Earth, accessing more of their multidimensionality, still have awareness of those in 3D. We just transcended the timeline, or that timeline that was the old Earth, and much like the way we transcend ego to access higher levels of consciousness, the old Earth energies to us are inert, though we're still aware of it. Okay, does that make sense? Now, many of us are having light codes, higher dimensional codes of 60, 70, 18, 90, sometimes even 10, 11, 12, filter in, but it is uncomfortable to many who are experiencing this because we're still playing the game of master and servant, follow the leader with the ego to some degree. And on some level, we're not willing to let go of this fear of the unknown. And this may not be a conscious connection. You might be saying, well, Kathryn, that you're full of crap because I'm doing all this work and I'm really excited about 5D and I'm still, you know, I'm doing this work every day and I'm accessing all these great light codes and whatever, but how come I have these incredible ascension symptoms? Because there is somewhere within you that wants to still be this dense product of form that defines itself through sensory feedback of your outer environment, which is basically an illusion. And it is because we still have this physical body that this is one of the most difficult things to transcend completely. Because also we do live in a time where there is a lot of tumultuous energy on this planet. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of contradiction. There's a lot of turmoil. We are going to get triggered by that. We're going to get affected by that. And if we don't know how to move ourselves out of that or move beyond those energies, and we just keep marinating in them, you're going to have a harder time accessing these light codes, because anytime you stay in a vibration of denser energy, you make the body more dense. Please understand that parallel, okay? This may not be a conscious participation on your part, because largely we are led by 95% of unconscious behavior, because the subconscious is just on a program, it's on autopilot. We are not consciously checked into our reality, much of us, throughout our day. So it's normal, really, to feel this way, to feel really dense, to feel led by the ego, even if we feel like we're not consciously participating in it. Unconsciously, we may be, and we most likely are, okay? We're still playing this game of master and servant with the ego, and on some level not willing to let go of the fear of the unknown, or in other words, what can be known without our human suit, without the physical body. So this is just more consciousness. We talk about 60, 70, 80. There isn't anything in particular that, I mean, some people would argue with me, but there isn't anything particular that happens there. It's like 60 is known for this and 70 is known for that. Like, that's very rigid. And to me, people try to explain it that way. It's a very rigid confine of explaining something that seems still to be defined by something that we can only understand with our linear, analytical, rational mind. When you talk about bumping up against these higher levels of consciousness, you move beyond the rational mind. You may access levels of the higher mind, but even then, the higher mind is kind of limited, because the higher mind is still grappling with, or kind of struggling with, this idea to kind of decompartmentalize or break down or deconstruct something that we can derive meaning from. But accessing higher levels of consciousness is not necessarily about meaning, because that's something that's aligned with the ego. It's about accessing higher levels of awareness, knowing the unknowable. What is meaning in that sense? How do you expect something like that to mean something to you? You just have heightened levels of perception, a more expanded awareness, meaning you just go outwards. You go outwards, upwards and outwards, and in all directions feeling more of a oneness with the void. Because the further that we go out in our 12D, you could call it the Rishi body, but our 12-dimensional consciousness avatar, if you think about 12D and accessing like most of our, or more of our galactic self, you move beyond certain language or verbiage to try to explain it, like meaning. Meaning literally has no meaning. So it's just more consciousness, expanded levels of perception, expanded awareness, more awareness of self, accessing the galactic self, if you want to call it that, our divine nature, the God force, the void, the womb of cosmic consciousness. And here we are, bumping up against these levels of consciousness, convincing ourselves we don't know what to do with it, and thinking, well, what am I going to do with it? I'm afraid of this. So we kind of pull back on an unconscious level because we're still basically, on an ego level, wired for survival. We're working with a 10,000-year-old brain in terms of its hardware and how it wires the body and the mind to keep us safe. So when we talk about the unknown, we talk about these really nebulous concepts like the womb of cosmic consciousness, there is this unconscious level that kind of kicks in and makes us not want to fully participate in that. It's just because that's the way we're wired, because we have a physical body and we're bumping up against form. And when we're not bumping it up against form, we get afraid. What else do I want to say about that? But in fact, when we are accessing these higher levels of pure consciousness and we're going outward, what's happening is that we are getting clearer instruction all the time about what to do. Now again, this isn't coming in through the higher mind, even it's not coming in on an intellectual level, it's a felt state. We are feeling it. We are knowing it. Those of us who are claircognizant, maybe you're knowing it. If you're clairsentient, you're feeling it. Maybe you're clairaudient, maybe you're hearing things. Maybe you're hearing, like, it's okay to do this, it's okay to be this, it's okay to act this way. We're getting very clear instruction about what to do, and in essence, it's about shedding the old self. Because until we shed the old self and move beyond the ego, which will not support us in where we are going, quote unquote, in an esoteric sense, we have to stop pretending that we can still be the same old person. We have to stop pretending that that there is such a thing as lack. Because that, again, is a completely human ego construct. There is no lack. There is no lack. There's no such thing. That does not exist. That is a completely human construct. In terms of the limitless availabilities of things, possibilities, potentials in the universe, there is more than everything available for everyone who needs it or wants to create, because we are literally creating everything that we need from the fabric of pure form. We are molding the clay of form from the energy of pure essence, because we are creators. And if you are believing something other than that, good luck ascending. Sorry, I don't mean to be glib or snide. Stop pretending that you can still be the same old person. These are the informational tidbits, these nuggets of wisdom that are coming in from heightened states of awareness, 60, 70, 80 and beyond, because we have a lot of portals opening, we have a lot of timeline shifts and jumps that are happening right now. This is the information that's coming in. Stop looking for some source outside of you to create change inside. It's never going to work. It has never worked that way. We have maybe allowed ourselves to buy and sell that lie to ourselves over and over, but that's never been the way that it is. Nothing happens to you externally that will change who you are internally. It's always the opposite. But because of this sensory feedback loop, what we can do is just feed more of that internal state from what we get from sensory feedback or from our internal environment. Stop buying into the illusion of fear, of suffering, of lack, limitation. Again, there's no lack, there's no limitation. Of hatred, resentment, blame. Start thinking, feeling, and behaving differently now, because this activates and creates a new timeline aligned with a higher vibe, okay? Your natural point of attraction when you do this, okay, by just thinking differently, which allows you to feel differently, because those are constantly moving in a feedback loop with each other, your thoughts and your feelings, which is a good thing. Your natural point of attraction, when you start doing that, moves to a higher vibe, and it draws others to you to merge and converge into that bigger timeline that I was talking about, a bigger container of experience to close the gap between where we are in 3D and where we desire to be in 5D, okay? The more of us that do this, the more we create the grid for the new earth. We speed up the timeline for ascension. So there it is. Okay. I welcome anyone who has comments or questions. Tammy Lip says, can the ego expand into some of these ideas as we experience the higher dimensions? No, the ego can't expand beyond 4D. Not possible. Because remember what I said about the ego is that the only information that can come to you from the ego, the only information available to the ego to inform its perspective, is based on what is known. And what is known is what we understand in the physical realm as sensory input from our outer environment. So literally any information that comes to us from the 5 senses: sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smelling. Past experiences come to us from this basis of sensory input, okay? It's what we think of as the past, who we think we are in the past, who we think we are in the present, who we think we will be in the future is largely dictated by who we think we are in the present and the past. And this is all from a level of sensory input. If you're talking about like the ego being able to see a future trajectory, it can only mimic or kind of doctor up a future trajectory based on what has happened or what has been known before. It has no ability to think outside of or access any information beyond what is known, what has happened, what is happening. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? In other words, we can't take the ego with us. But we will have an awareness of it. Because, as I said, as we move into 5D and beyond, we are still this composite of all the other dimensions that make up 5D. Like you can't just be 5D and not be 4, 3, 2, and 1. You can't. That's not how it works. You're the sum total of all the other dimensions that add up to 5D, basically. But how do I say this better? We are experiencing this bridge of consciousness versus form. And we're trying to reconcile these two. That's why through the first 4 dimensions of our reality, we are bumping up against things physical. This is us in a body. This is us relating to this physical vessel or frame of experience that is our physical body. But we are also bumping up against higher levels of awareness. We are bumping up against accelerated, heightened levels of consciousness, okay? So we are physical and we are non-physical. We are dual and we are non-dual. This is what we are constantly trying to reconcile ourselves with here in this time-space continuum. So what I wanted to talk about here is hopefully a way that will help you understand that a little bit better, okay? Tammy Lip, yes, just wondered if it could evolve to include more 5D or higher concepts as they become more prevalent, but it sounds like that is a no. No. Nope. The ego is a part of your subconscious. So what does ascend, what does evolve, is the subconscious. And when you think about the subconscious as this kind of the most raw place of our consciousness, the most vast and open and full of potential place of our consciousness, what we're largely accessing as the subconscious ascends, because everything on this planet is ascending, okay? And that includes our subconscious and our mind. The way our mind is wired, our brains are ascending. And when our brains ascend, that means the mind, which is the brain in action, is ascending into different levels of disseminating, understanding, and bridging gaps in consciousness. So the subconscious, which is largely linked to our divinity, is evolving for us to access more of our divinity. That means we leave that ego part of the subconscious behind or render it inert. We're not necessarily getting rid of it because we can't get rid of it, but we render that part of the subconscious inert because it is not vibrating at a level. If you think in terms of, everything is energy, frequency, and vibration. Tesla said that, and he was right. I think he was an alien. Everything is energy, frequency, and vibration. So if you think of everything in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration, think of your ego as a low frequency. That it has a certain vibrational limit, and once it reaches that, it is vibrationally unavailable for ascension. But the rest of the subconscious is, because your subconscious is 95% of where your conditioned behaviors come from and who you are, who you think you are, or your potential ways of being. When this gets more linked to our divinity as we bump up against higher levels of consciousness, what's ascending is the subconscious that is linked to our divinity and not the subconscious that is linked to the ego. So you say that when we evolve, we create a parallel Earth. Yes, where we live in a higher consciousness, but we can still be standing right next to someone who didn't want to evolve, who would be on the old Earth. Yep. And this is where we have the hardest time. That's why I mentioned when I was talking about that this is where we bump up against the biggest part of our ego. Because we can't wrap our minds around this. And the problem is that we're trying to wrap our minds around it with a limited frame of mind. We're trying to think of it from an egoic perspective. We're trying to think of it from a rational, intellectual, analytical perspective. And it doesn't really work that way. If you were to think about it in terms of vibration, think about, you could be standing next to someone in line at a grocery store who's really, really friggin' angry. Who's like white hot with anger. Maybe they were out of his favorite milk, or they didn't have his candy bar in the checkout aisle. And here you are just going about your day, and you're having a great day. Your kids are on their best behavior. You have, let's just say, some rewards on your reward card for grocery shopping, or you get like $20 off your order. Things are going great for you, but you can be standing right next to this person who's literally an erupting volcano of anger. It's kind of the same thing. And the difference is that those who are not going to be part of the ascending 5D Earth, they will have no awareness of us, because they are vibrationally unavailable to perceive us. But because we will encompass every dimension and realm of consciousness that precedes us, we will have a level of consciousness where we're aware of them, but we're not participating in that reality anymore. This is what really gets people hung up. It is so incredible. I feel it. I love it in my heart, and know that it can be totally true. So, so that I can expand and ascend. Yes. I hope that makes sense, Tammy. So this has hopefully been some eye-opening and mind-blowing stuff for you. I invite you to really think about this. Like how a dog whistle is only heard by a dog. The sound is there but not available to everyone. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it, Tammy. Yeah. If that is, again, we're trying to understand this from a place of our intellectual mind, right? We want to, because we understand spatial relationships, we want to understand this in a way where it's like we can bump up against this level of knowledge so we can get it. That's fine for a while, but doing that constantly keeps you in ego awareness, because it's like you have to, when you're trying to figure things out on this level, it's like you have to constantly validate your physical experience of understanding something. But really, this is a place that we're moving into now, we're moving forward into, where it's just known. Reminds me of a saying, I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. Yeah, I mean, I really think of it as we are spiritual beings having a human awakening, because we're already spiritually awakened. But what we're doing is trying to reconcile that with our human selves. We're wearing this human suit here in this time-space reality, and we are going through a process of trying to, let's just say, bring home, meaning where we came from, the higher elevated consciousness that we derived from. We're trying to bring more of that here, so that involves us in a human awakening. Yeah. Well, I hope that this information has really helped you and been eye-opening and enlightening for you. And I hope it kind of brings in a little more understanding. So if you understand, if you're having a really, really tough time with this process of ascension, this will give you a little more insight as to why and what you need to look at, what you need to look for, where you're probably still largely unconsciously participating in an egoic perspective, and how that is going to keep you locked into the rigid confines of experiencing 3D reality and not necessarily being on this fast track alignment with an ascension timeline. Because many of us think that, you know, we're doing all this work, we are doing all the activations and whatever, but if this feels hard or it feels like you're just not waking up, it's because you're still probably on an unconscious level participating in an ego experience. Because you're constantly looking for ways to define your life through the body, through sensory feedback in your environment, things like that, to give you meaning, to derive meaning. And when I talked about accessing these higher levels of consciousness, we kind of go beyond that word meaning. Because meaning really means that we're trying to validate our physical experience. If we are accessing higher levels of consciousness, we're not really trying to validate our physical experience. We're moving beyond that. I know it's really hard to explain. So I'm just going to leave it right here before I go down this whole other rabbit hole and open up a whole other wormhole. So I want to wish you all so much love and peace. How can one measure where we are with that ego? Exactly. And there isn't, when we get to that certain level of consciousness, there is no measuring, because then what is measurement if you have no time-space continuum? If you move beyond linear time in the fourth dimension, you move beyond measurement, essentially. If you move beyond the first 4 dimensions, you move beyond measurement. So then what is that in 7D? What is that in 8D, 9D, 10, 11, 12? It doesn't have any meaning, right? All right, lovelies, thank you for being here, watching me live. Do share this. Please do share this. If you have a group, people in your group that you think that this would benefit them, please do share it. I welcome you to do that. And I want to wish you so much love and peace. Have a beautiful week. Bye.